Hello, kids, and welcome to debate class. Today, we're going to be splitting up the room 50-50 and having a conversation that will hopefully enlighten our minds. We are putting up Temple of the False God versus Ancient Tomb. I don't know. I can't keep up that act. Hi, welcome back to the Geek and Speak podcast. I am your host, Morgan. Today, that is what we are doing, though. We are having a debate about Ancient Tomb versus Temple of the False God. Joining me today is... on the side of Temple of the False God, we have Preston. Preston, how's it going, man?
I'm doing pretty good. Excited to talk about this little debate here.
Yes, it's been an ongoing joke in our play group for many a year, so it's going to be nice to actually hash it out for half an hour, however long this ends up being. And then in defense of Ancient Tomb, we have Jason. How's it going, man?
Pretty good. I feel good about my argument.
Yeah, I think you should. You not sad about the Lions anymore?
Oh, I mean, no.
Okay,
I like
cool,
it.
cool.
Just needed a few days. Now it's on the next season.
All right. Cool. Yeah, so we are going to kind of do this debate style. We're going to let the guys take turns bringing up their points, and then after they have their points and have a chance to respond to each other, then we're going to just go into a free-form conversation about the points that they make. And I'm going to do my best to stay out of it. I'm a little bit in the middle, so I will be doing my best to, if I feel like someone's forgetting something, I'll do my best to bring it up so that it doesn't get overlooked. But for the most part, we're just going to let the guys hash it out. But before we get into this, reminder that if you would like to support the show, you can over at patreon.com/geekandseekyoutube. And if you can't support us financially, that's cool. You can also just like this video, leave comments if you have any thoughts, subscribe if you're not subscribed, and then check out some of our other videos. We've been doing this for a while. I think we have like 200 videos or something. So plenty of other content that you can go back, check out if you might have missed something cool. Do we want to go ahead and hop into the news?
Yeah, so first up, last week's podcast episode was talking about our favorite cards from the new set. I think we had a really good discussion about those cards. We all really liked what we saw. And how have you boys felt about it after we've got about a week or so out now?
Well, I will say, since we're recording the podcast a little bit ahead of time, I haven't got to play with very many of the cards. I've got to play with some of them on Arena, but that's it so far. But there are a few cards that since we recorded that episode, I've gone back and been like, oh, actually, this card's kind of gas. So I think there's even more stuff than what we just talked about in that episode.
For me with that, I kind of didn't realize that there was now a card in green that says a deck can have any number of cards named this card.
Oh, yeah, the slime or whatever.
Ooze, or whatever. I can't remember what it's called, but oh my gosh, I want to play with that now. I want to build, because I used to have a Persistent Petitioners deck. Yes. So I just love that concept. I think it's cool that that's something that green now gets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I ran against one of those yesterday, I think. It's a good card.
Really?
And it's a common, too, I'm pretty sure.
It is a common, yeah. It's one of those few like $2 commons that we get every now and then. So that's pretty interesting. Jason, you want to hit this next topic of news?
Yeah, so coming up March 8th, we're going to get a new Universes Beyond, and it's going to be the Fallout universe. And we're going to get Commander Precons from that universe. I know Preston is big into Fallout. Not something I have a lot of experience with, but I do love the company that makes them, because I play Skyrim.
Bethesda.
Yeah. So that's cool. And the Universes Beyond sets have recently been pretty good. I mean, even though we talked about Doctor Who and none of us really know a lot about Doctor Who, there's still pretty good cards in that set. So this is exciting. Preston, how do you feel about this Fallout set coming out?
So I love Fallout 4 and I like the lore a lot, but I haven't really touched the other games, not super interested. So the Fallout 4 deck of them is the Dogmeat one, which is ironically enough the deck I'm not really that interested in. It's an artifact-y sort of equipment deck. But overall, the other three decks all look pretty spicy. Like that mutant one.
Yeah, it looks pretty sweet.
So, yeah. Yeah, they look pretty cool.
I might pick up the energy counter one because I have an energy counter deck and it's really jank. So I'm excited to have some new toys to upgrade that deck. I will say that I don't know if we're doing an episode of Upkeep about it. I would like to be doing an episode of Upkeep around every new set, but that would be like half the episodes of Upkeep, It would just take a lot of time, and it takes, when Wizards helps out, when Wizards sends us the stuff and we can do those episodes, that makes it a lot easier. But if they're not helping us to do that, it makes it a lot harder to do those episodes. So if we can, we will. If we can't, we'll try to do something with the Fallout stuff. But yeah, are you excited about them, Jason?
Dude, I'm excited for any new Universes Beyond stuff that comes out, just because what are we going to get? What's the next One Ring that's going to get, placed in our laps?
Well, I don't know if I need any more $60 staples in my life, but I know what you mean, though. And then the only other piece of news that I wanted to share with you guys is that last week on the podcast, I said that we would have a merch announcement pretty soon, and unfortunately, Jason's having a little bit of tech issues, and so I'm having to pick up some of the extra editing. So I haven't been able to finalize that stuff yet, but I'm hoping that next week's podcast episode, I will finally be able to show you exactly what we have brewing. Pretty excited. It's going to be fun. And that would be a great way to help support the show as well, as picking up some merch. And I think we mentioned this before, but if you're joining us on Patreon, that's also a way to get discounted merch as well. Let's hop into our main topic, Ancient Tomb versus Temple of the False God. Like I said, this is an ongoing meme in our play group, right? Like every time someone plays Temple of the False God, Preston will say something really edgy, like, "Oh my God, it's the best card in Magic."
The best card in the
yeah, or he'll be like, "Oh look, it's the good version of Ancient Tomb." Like that's something that if you go back and watch our gameplay series, that's something that has been said probably every time either Ancient Tomb or Temple of the False God has shown up. Or yeah, I think last time we saw Ancient Tomb, someone was like, "Oh look, it's the bad Temple of the False God."
Tommy said it last time.
Tommy said it. What an edgelord. And we actually did a poll. I'll see if I can find the screenshot of it, but we did a poll like months ago on our community tab, and like 80% of our fans said that Ancient Tomb was better. Gang. But we're gonna have a more in-depth discussion because I think it's slightly more nuanced than people give it credit for. So, with that said, Preston, do you want to start us off for like 1 or 2 minutes, just give your defense of Temple of the False God, and then we'll hop over to Jason for 1 or 2 minutes, and he will give his answer for Ancient Tomb. Do your best to just stick with your card on this first round of you speaking. Try just talking about your card and not talking so much about the other card. But go ahead, Preston.
All right, so first off, I really wanted to point out I am specifically talking about Casual Commander, not CDH, not any of the 1v1 formats with like 60 cards, just Casual Commander, that 5 to 8 power level we all know and love. So one of the first things I wanted to point out is that getting to 5 lands is a lot easier than people typically give it credit for. Like, most games of Commander are going to last long enough. You should not be regularly having issues getting to 5 lands. Yeah, there are going to be times that happens, but there's going to be times where every card in your deck doesn't do anything because of the situation going on the board state. That's just Magic, especially Commander. So, it's a slower format. It's easier to get to that 5 lands than it is anywhere else. So that's one of the first big points I think needs to be made in this discussion.
All right. Jason, do you want to talk for a minute or two about Ancient Tomb?
So Ancient Tomb is just a better card overall. In casual formats, in competitive formats, it is the better card. You will always have access to life at the beginning of the game. You may not always have 4 lands when you're playing Temple of the False God. So the fact that the Ancient Tomb restriction is life-based, playing it early is a lot more impactful because at the beginning of the game you have the most life that you will likely have during the course of the game. So it is a more efficient land. And regardless of the level of competition, it is the better choice.
All right. Preston, do you want to take a minute or two to respond to Jason's point?
It's funny that Jason points that out, because a lot of people are like, your life total is doubling, Commander. And while technically 40 is twice as big as 20, you also have 3 times as many people trying to take you out of the game. That 40 life goes down much quicker than your 20 life does in a lot of 1v1 situations. Like, unless you're playing against aggro, your life total will actually go down quicker in Commander than in most of the other formats. So, yeah, you start out with a high life total, but it goes down very quickly. If you get it out on turn 1, by turn 5, that's a fourth of your life gone if you use it every turn. And if you're not using it every turn, you have screwed yourself out of one of your land drops, essentially, because you're not using it, because it's doing a ton of damage to you every single time you want to use it. Okay, so my next point was that most Magic the Gathering players are within the late teens to early adult stage of their life. Now, I don't know about you two, but most people, including myself, throughout most of that period of their life, are broke as hell. Temple of the False God is a 20-cent card. Ancient Tomb is a $92 card. That is a 460% increase in price, and you are definitely not getting a 460 increase in win rate percentage if you play Tomb over Temple. You just aren't. That's a pretty objective math fact. So, like, trying to justify spending $92 on a card in your 99 is just too much for most players. That's way too much for one land that they will hit some of their games in.
I don't think I had realized that it had gotten that expensive, because when I picked up my, I do the thing where I buy like one copy of a card, and then like when I have it in multiple decks, I just move it around. When I picked mine up, it was like $40. And honestly, I thought 40 was a lot back then.
Yeah, it's already shot up that expensive again.
Yeah. Jason, do you want to take a few minutes to respond to any of Preston's points?
Just because a card has the ability to do a lot of damage to you while you're using your life as a resource, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should avoid playing it. Incidental life gain is kind of common in Commander now. I mean, you have cards like Swords to Plowshare that, exiling a creature and its controller is going to gain life. So really, if you're playing Ancient Tomb, you should be spending that mana to establish your board state and move the game forward, which by turn 5, you should have done a pretty decent job of. I mean, I would say if you look at any of our gameplays by turn 5, things are already kind of happening on the board. People are already starting to make themselves targets. So, and I think that a lot of other cards that people are putting into their decks now are going to provide you with that life gain, whether it's in the form of lifelink or, if something happens, you gain a life and opponents lose a life. Extort is a really prevalent ability in the format that I've seen. I mean, I know it's happened in a lot of our games. So I think that the incidental life gain that is just prevalent in the format is going to balance out the life loss from Ancient Tomb. And as far as the price, you can find it for about $70, but you also can pull it from certain packs. They've reprinted it a few times, and they're going to keep reprinting it. So it's going to keep coming out, and you're going to still have chances to get it. And then also, this is a social community. People can make trades. You can trade stuff. Like, I've traded for my Sensei's Divining Top and other big, expensive artifacts like that. I think that in this community, you'd probably be willing to find, especially with the internet and how easy it is to access random people in the community just to try and find trades like that. I think that there are ways around it, and then you can get one copy and then make proxies for your other decks, or just move that copy between the other decks that you have. There are ways around it, and I think if you're just talking about playing the card in the game, it's going to provide you with more consistent value than a card that is dependent on you having four or more other lands on the battlefield by the time that it enters. And here's the point that I wanted to make. Ancient Tomb is a better land than Temple of the False Gods in a situation where you're just not drawing lands. Because an Ancient Tomb and a forest, that equals a Kodama's Reach. That equals a Cultivate. That equals some other 3-mana ramp spell that is going to get you in a better position to play more spells, give your deck a shuffle. Maybe you shuffle a land to the top, something like that. A Temple of the False God and a forest just makes you sad. Because you're so close. You're not even really so close. You're really not. But in those situations, Ancient Tomb is going to help you catch up to the rest of the table.
So I think that we should go into that last point that Jason was making. But before then, I think we need to back up just a smidge, because I think there's an important thing we should mention is that Ancient Tomb is prohibitively expensive to a decent amount of players, right? There are people who they can afford to spend the money, or they were like me and picked it up when it was a little bit cheaper, or they opened one in a pack, or they got one years and years and years ago, or whatever. But there are plenty of people who they're maybe newer to the game, or maybe they haven't taken it as seriously until more recently. And the $80 price tag or whatever it is quite a bit, which then can make Temple of the False God, which is 25 cents, a lot more appealing. What I want to ask, though, is there an argument to be made that we shouldn't talk about price? Because if we were just going to say price is not a factor in this, we would say, it would be like Overgrown Tomb versus Bayou, right? Objectively speaking, Bayou is better, but it's $400 or whatever, right? So do we want to even have price as a part of this conversation between that and the fact that I think, broadly speaking, the community has become a lot more accepting of proxies. Maybe there's the argument that Ancient Tomb is good enough that if you proxy it up, you're power creeping your pod more than you want to, right? But if your pod is at that power level, you guys might just be on the same page of we just want to play the game, we don't care about proxies. So between just wanting to keep the conversation specifically about the functionality and power, and between the fact that the community is at least moderately okay with proxies, do we even want to have price as a important part of this conversation?
You cannot just ignore price in this, because people can't just ignore the fact that it's a $90 card. They just can't. Sure, their playgroup might allow it, but what if they want to go to Friday Night Magic? There's no guarantee that their proxy is going to be allowed there. Sure. So if they want to be able to be for sure be able to play their deck, they have to spend the $90. And there are more people playing Magic who can afford that than there are who can. Millions of people play this game, and most of them are in that age range where they just don't have that kind of money lying around. The three of us, we're all doing pretty good for ourselves at the moment. I have an Ancient Tomb ready in my binder system. You have one. Jason has one. We're all doing pretty good right now as far as what we can spend, but we're not as well off as some of the other people in Magic, and most people are less well off than us. That's just something you have to acknowledge when you're talking about how good is this card. It doesn't matter if it's the best card ever printed. I can't afford to put it in this deck. That's very important to discuss.
I agree that we shouldn't ignore price, but I don't think that price is too big of an obstacle to overcome. Because if you're going to hang your hat on this card is too expensive for a casual deck, then why are so many casual decks running cards like Rhystic Study, cards like Esper Sentinel, cards like,
cards that are expensive but incredibly powerful, yet you see them all the time in
Right.
casual pods?
Because you don't have a significantly cheaper option that does almost the same thing, just slightly behind curve. You don't have a budget Esper Sentinel hitting on the back.
That's fair.
Okay, so then maybe Esper Sentinel is a bad example. But there are plenty of people who just play casual Commander who have decks that contain expensive cards. And whether that's just the good Commander staples or the expensive cards because they help the deck do something that it really wants to do. I think Anointed Procession, that's a good example. There's a bunch of different cards in white, now that double tokens. And they're all decently expensive. But if it's a card that objectively is going to make your deck stronger, then you're going to spend the money or make the trades to find a way to put it in.
Do you think people actually... Go ahead, Preston.
I was going to say, in that scenario, that's a very important card for your deck's theme. Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God, they're just a little more mana for your deck. You can build almost any deck without either of those in it, and they'll still be functional. They are not necessary the way those token doublers are for any deck that can run them. Like, your win percentage is going to skyrocket with those sort of specific, this does what my deck wants to do sort of cards versus just better lands. Like, they're important, but they're not nearly as important or impactful to your deck overall.
I disagree completely. I think that having a good mana base is going to determine whether you're going to win more games or lose more games. If you don't have a proper mana base,
mana per land.
If you don't have a proper mana base and can't set your turns up the way that you need to in order to secure that you're going to be able to do the things that you want to do and not be able to get stopped by your opponents, having cards that are going to ensure that you will have mana when they hit the battlefield is going to be a way bigger factor in determining who wins and who loses than the actual cards that you're playing. Because I could have, 10 lands and, maybe 5 or 6 just burn spells, just play something quick and do damage to you. And you could have 2 or 3 lands, but you could have Expropriate. You have an I'm going to win the game right now card. I have, let me just do a little bit of damage cards, but I can actually play my stuff because I have the mana for it. You are now just sitting there looking at that Expropriate in your hand being like, man, I wish I had more mana. And that's exactly how it feels when you play a Temple of the False God on turn 2 or turn 3, and you have 1 or 2 other lands on the battlefield, and you can't do anything with it. You're just looking at it, and then you draw card after card, and it's not a land, and now you're just sitting there with 3 cards on the board. One of those 3 cards doesn't do anything right now. Ancient Tomb, you'll never have that problem.
So Cabal Coffers is a bad card.
Cabal Coffers...
Nyxos Shrine to Nyx is a bad card. Gaia's Cradle sucks, Jason. You have to have creatures out for it to tap for any meaningful mana? What a dog water card. That's not going to be good until at least turn 3.
Those are
maybe even 5 or 6.
Those are all cards that are
some of the best in the format?
that sort of fit into that dynamic that you're talking about with Anointed Procession, where this card goes with the theme of the deck. You don't put Gaia's Cradle in a deck that doesn't have a lot of creatures. That doesn't make sense. No one would build a deck like that. No one would build a deck with 8 creatures in it and put a Gaia's Cradle in it. No one's going to do that, Preston.
So, I think that Jason made a good point about it's worth spending the money on a good mana base. So if you look at like the power level and price of like a power, like let's say like 5 or 6 versus a 7 or an 8, the 99 and the commanders and all of that, as far as like just strictly power level goes, the price of the decks is going to be about the same, and the functionality of the decks is going to be about the same. The difference that I've noticed is your mana base. Because if your deck is the same, if you're running like the stapley cards and the cards that are like, this is, a card that for this specific deck is an all-star, but then you're playing a bunch of basics, or your dual lands all come into the battlefield tapped, or stuff like that, that deck is just not going to function as well as a deck that is running a lot more lands that are dual lands that will come in untapped. Like, that's the biggest difference in power scale, is what your mana base looks like. So, which is frustrating as a Magic player, right? Because lands are not the exciting cards. Like, we don't wake up in the morning and be like, oh man, I can't wait to upgrade the land base in my new precon. Like we don't do that. But that's the main thing that is going to take your deck from a lower power to a higher power, is the consistency and speed of your deck. Not necessarily, I mean, like if you're playing like Kobold Tribal, right? Like that deck's probably not going to do as well as the green Stompy deck, just on average, right? But the biggest factor is actually going to be the consistency of your deck. So I thought that was an interesting point. And I'm glad we talked about the price, because I do agree that it's like one of those things that it's really annoying. Like I said, it's boring. No one gets excited about upgrading mana bases, but it's worth talking about. Is there anything else there with what Preston was saying about like Nykthos and Cabal Coffers and lands like that? Because I feel like the comparison is somewhat similar, right? Like the ceiling on those cards is it's insane. I think with Nykthos, it's not that bad, because Nykthos is always going to come in untapped, and you're always going to be able to tap it right away for a colorless. And then the ceiling is that if I get a high devotion, I'm going to have an absurd amount of mana. Whereas Cabal Coffers, it's sometimes going to come in and do nothing. Is there any comparison there between Ancient Tomb and Temple, or is that kind of its own animal?
Those are in their own category because of like the point that Preston brought up when I brought up Anointed Procession. Those cards are going to go into specific decks that want them there. You're really only going to put Cabal Coffers into a mono black, or maybe a like guild, like a dual color, a 2-color deck. You get past that, and depending on what that third color is, like if it's green, you might be able to run it because you'll probably be able to search for it and put it into your hand. Then again, you could also just tutor it with a black spell. But these aren't lands that can objectively go into every deck and be good. And that is the difference. That is what I feel like we're discussing right now. Because you could put Ancient Tomb in any deck, and it will perform well and be a good addition to that mana base, no matter what the deck is. It doesn't matter. You talk about Gaia's Cradle, Cabal Coffers, Nykthos. Those aren't necessarily going to be lands you want in every single deck.
Is there any downside then to the fact that Temple and Tomb are always making colorless? Like, I agree that like 1-2 color decks auto includes, but when you get to like the 3 to 5 color decks, are you still auto including those cards, or do you have to really think hard about whether or not it's worth adding? Like, is the fact that it's always going to tap for colorless, is that downside?
If your deck needs a ton of mana, I think the cards are worth playing. But if your deck is like lower on like the CMC, they probably don't belong in a deck with that many colors. I really don't think they belong.
I don't think that you necessarily need to think about how much mana your deck needs in order to play it. To me, it goes in every single commander deck because it helps pay for the commander tax. It's one land that by itself can pay for one turn of, or for one, I guess, instance of commander tax. If you play your commander and it gets destroyed. And your next turn, you draw Ancient Tomb, and you play the Ancient Tomb. Now you can play your commander again right away, because the Ancient Tomb itself in one land pays for that commander tax. So I think in a format where 2 generic mana is actually something that's actually really important, I think that having this in there provides a benefit that it doesn't necessarily do for other formats.
I think part of this has to do with the price conversation, because these aren't necessarily cheap cards. But is there any argument that maybe Temple is at least a little bit better when paired with cards like Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, and Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth? Because if one of those is in play, then your Temple of the False God will still be able to tap for mana. Or if you have some other effect like that. The problem there is that, like, well, if budget is really the problem, you're probably not running those cards. Yavimaya is not that bad. It's like an $8 card or something. But Urborg is like a $30 card, right? So, like, if budget's the problem, you're probably not running those cards, which is similar to another thing that I'll try remembering to bring up later. But is there any argument that those cards make Temple better?
Let me ask you this question. Does Blood Moon make Temple of the False God playable? And if there is an
mono red deck,
argument
I would
for
totally
that,
do that.
if there is an argument for that, then I just don't see it. You know, I think that if you're adding in another card that is moderately expensive, might be a third of the price of Ancient Tomb, but if you're adding in a whole other land just to make this 1 20-cent land viable, or even improve its viability, I just don't see how it's worth it. Because those cards, Urborg and Yavimaya, they'll make just about any land better. Doesn't really matter. You know, unless it's a basic swamp for Urborg or a basic forest for Yavimaya, because then it really doesn't do anything for that. But you're not playing it in those decks.
Yeah, I feel like the fact that they do tap for colorless shouldn't be ignored. Like, that can definitely be an issue with your deck if you really need your colored pips. So running too many colorless lands is definitely something I feel like a lot of beginner players do run into. But beginning players also aren't spending $90 on a land, so not the biggest point in the world.
Those lands tapping for colorless can also be of benefit to people who don't know that much about the game, people who are still new, because you can just use that for generic mana cost every time. You know, you don't have to just sit there and think, you know, what's the smartest way for me to use the mana available to me. With Ancient Tomb, you know, you can just tap it, and, you know, if a spell is like 1 blue and 2, then you tap an island, you tap the Ancient Tomb, boom, you got the 1 and 2. You don't have to think about it very much. So it can be a benefit in that regard.
So I think the biggest thing with the Temple versus Tomb conversation that people get hung up on is the fact that Temple does basically nothing for the first half of the game, whereas Ancient Tomb can come out turn 1 and immediately start doing something. Like, I can't even tell you how many times I've Ancient Tombed into a follow-up. You obviously can't do that with Temple unless you're playing, like we said, Urborg or Yavimaya, and even then it like still can't be your first land. So let me ask you this. What does your hand have to look like? Like, worst case scenario, what does your hand have to look like? Your opening hand have to look like in order for you to be like, this has Temple of the False God, but I'm going to keep it. Flip side, this hand has Ancient Tomb, I'm going to keep it. Like, what does your starting hand have to look like, and you be willing to keep the hand?
Me, if I'm starting my game with Temple of the False God in my hand, I need 3 lands in hand and a ramp spell.
Well, that's almost your entire hand right there. What about you, Preston? If you have Temple of the False God in your opening hand, what does your hand have to look like in order for you to justify keeping that hand?
I don't want it in my opening hand. I don't think I almost would ever keep an opening hand with it. because I don't view it as an early card. I wouldn't be super likely to keep a hand that has Bola Citadel in it either. Doesn't mean I'm not going to put it in a black deck.
At any point in the game, if you look at your hand and you have Ancient Tomb in your hand, beginning of the game, middle of the game, late game, you're like, this is a good land, I'm going to play it.
So, yeah, I guess with Ancient Tomb, then, since it is obviously better earlier in the game, is there a opening hand you could have that would make you mull it away anyways? Like, other than like maybe like the obvious example would be like you're a 3-color deck and it's your only land in hand, right? Like then obviously you would mill it away. But are there other situations where you would see doing that, or do you think that more times than not is just making your opening hand better?
I think that anytime that you have a hand, an opening hand, where it's Ancient Tomb and one other land, I think that's a mulligan. I don't think you should keep 2 lands, even though it's deceiving. It's 3 mana with 2 lands. I still don't think that it's risky, or I still don't think that it's worth the risk of just doing 2 damage to yourself and only having access to 3 mana for the first couple of turns. I think that that's a mulligan, and basically you really want it to be your 3rd land in your hand. You want to have 2 other lands and then the Ancient Tomb. But that's, to me, the perfect opening hand has 3 lands in it. That's just kind of how I see it.
Yeah, do you have anything to add, Preston?
Yeah, no, I think Ancient Tomb is a much better card in regard to the opening hand. Like, I'm not arguing that. I'm not, I like to play up the rivalry a bit just because it's fun to see Jason getting a little angry about it sometimes. But no, I'll totally concede that it's a much better card in your opening hand, especially if you have, I'd probably say 2 lands to go with it. That'd be a pretty solid opening hand most of the time.
You could have stopped that sentence at, I will concede that it is that it is the better card. You could have just stopped it right there. Ended, period. Ended debate.
By the time you get to turn 6, it's worse, but
Well, so I would say that because there have been multiple times. So my curve in a lot of my decks is low enough that I can sometimes justify keeping a 2-land hand, depending on like what the other, like what my commander is. How many colors do I have? Do I have the right colors? Do I have some early game card draw in my hand? Depending on all of that, I agree that like the dream is like I have 3 lands in my hand plus some card draw and or ramp to either I already have all my colors or I'm going to get all my colors, right? That's the dream, right? But I will keep 2-land hands a lot of the time if one of them is if it's a 1 or 2 color deck and Ancient Tomb's there. I obviously can't do that with Temple. I feel like this is a great time to look at some math, all right? I have this in our doc. I have this on Drive for you guys here, and then I'll have it pop up on screen for the viewers at home. This is from a MTG Goldfish article that Tomer wrote that was in response to an article that Frank Karsten wrote on Channel Fireball. I'm going to try to link both of those articles in the description. I couldn't find the Channel Fireball one earlier, but I'm going to try to find it again, have both of these articles in there. This is a lot, but this is a screenshot from that Goldfish article. And I'm going to oversimplify it. I'll leave it up long enough that you guys can read it. But in general, if a deck has 35 other lands than Temple of the False God, your ability to use Temple is about 75% on curve. That's kind of low. But if you have 42 other lands in your deck, then it's about an 85. Now, obviously, that's why Jason doesn't like it, right? Because he runs 25 to 30 lands in his decks. So that's obviously why Jason doesn't like Temple of the False God. I wonder how much of that is a factor. I wonder if that's a part of this conversation we should have. But so that means that like land decks, like landfall decks, maybe Temple's not terrible. That means that there's like, only a 10 to 15% chance you get screwed. But if you're not that deck, 25% of the time screwing you over sounds kind of bad. Now, again, this math is assuming that you don't have like rampant growth effects. It's assuming you don't have Cygnus or Talisman. It's assuming you're not drawing more cards than your 1 card per turn. That's what this math is assuming. So obviously there's a lot of other factors, but like just as a blanket statement, in a deck that's running an average amount of lands, that's like not a lands matter deck, right? That means 25% of the time Temple of the False God is going to be a dead card. Discuss.
Any card that's going to be a dead card 25% of the time is not good enough for me.
I hate this math because it's not a dead card 25% of the time. Because it's 1 card in your 99. This math doesn't account for the fact you're not going to even see it most of the games you play that early. Like, you're going to get it later on in the game because it's 1 card in 99 cards. Or 98 if you're running a companion. Like,
well,
also, you have to not be playing the game for that math to work out that way. Like, if you're not drawing any extra cards, playing any additional lands, hitting any mana rocks, like, you probably kept a bad hand regardless.
Right.
But
so if your best argument is...
Tell me I'm wrong. There are instances where you draw it. You have there are times where you have 3 lands in hand. One of them is Temple of the False God. And you're like, all right, I'm going to ride it out. And then 5 turns go by and you didn't draw a single land. Or maybe you drew 1 land. And now you're on turn 6 and you have 4 lands on the battlefield. One of them is Temple of the False God. So really you only have 3 lands on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, I've had games where I've been playing the game, right? I'm drawing extra cards and all that, and I get to turn 4, and I'm like, man, I really need to hit my 4th land. I kept a 3-land hand. I've drawn extra cards. I still haven't seen a 4th land. Let's find it. Draw my card for the turn. It's Temple of the False God. Like, that has literally happened to me before, multiple times. So, like, that can't be ignored. Like, I agree that like this math is like worst case scenario, but that worst case scenario still happens often enough. It has to be addressed.
Yes, it does happen sometimes. And there are times where instead of Temple of the False God, you drew a card that cost 8 mana because it's a really good card, but doesn't help you right now. Saying this card is bad sometimes is very deconstructive because that's true of most of the cards in your deck.
No, we're not saying it's bad. Really we are giving you a specific instance. We are not generalizing this. We are saying in this specific instance, if you draw Temple of the False Gods, it's a bad draw. But if you draw Ancient Tomb in this instance, it's a good draw. Because one will tap for mana and one will not.
Okay, well, if we're going to play that game, let's imagine this. We're getting to the end of the game. Everyone's life totals are low. You have a really good spell in your hand, like ready to shoot off. You just need a little more mana. You top deck Ancient Tomb, you're at 2 life. Congratulations, you can't play it. I can make up hypotheticals all day, too.
We're talking about realistic situations, though, Preston. If you are at the
realistic, Jason.
Here's
drawing
how this is
Ancient Tomb near the end of the game when you're low life is realistic.
How your scenario is not realistic. Here's how it's not realistic. In this situation that you have just presented, it is towards the end of the game. Everyone's life totals are really low. If you need 2 more mana to play a spell at that point in the game, you were probably going to lose that game anyways, because you were so far behind on mana. If this is later in the game like you're suggesting, you should have more than enough mana to play any single spell in your deck. So
maybe you're an artifact deck and all of your rocks just got blown up.
Then you weren't going to win that game anyways.
I will say that we are getting into...
If you're set up for your win is determined based on the number of permanents that you can put onto the battlefield, permanents that are easily destroyed in this format, and you didn't prepare for those getting destroyed, and now you're banking on 2 more mana to play 1 spell, you didn't build your deck right. You didn't prepare properly for that situation.
But it's also a singleton format where you just don't have the consistency, right? And especially like, not just the fact that it's a singleton format, but also the fact that tutors are kind of frowned upon, right? In low power level pods. So your decks are just really inconsistent. So it's not even just a matter of I didn't prepare for this situation. I mean, maybe you didn't. Like, sure, there are times where it's like, I never thought about that. Like someone farewells and you have a bunch of artifact lands. Yikes, that sucks. But we're also getting into the dangerous territory of hypotheticals that, yes, they are going to happen, but anything's going to happen. This is a ridiculous game with thousands of cards available to us. And it's 4 decks with 100 card singleton. So like we could play the hypothetical game all day. There is another part of this math that I want to address. And that is towards the bottom, it's saying that if you're running 42 plus lands, then you're down to like a 10 to 15% chance that Temple is a dead card. Oh, I guess also about the dead card thing, there are a lot of cards that I will run that are technically dead cards. Counterspell. I run Counterspell in almost all of my blue decks. It's technically a dead card because it doesn't do anything. And realistically, because unless you're like a Talryn Counterspell tribal deck or a Baral Counterspell tribal deck, you can't just afford to be cracking off your counterspells, right? You have to wait and hold on to it to stop the one thing that's going to stop you, right? Or like if they get that board wipe off, they're going to win the game, or they're going to stop me from winning. So those are like dead cards that we still put in our decks anyway. So I will concede that ground to Preston between the hypotheticals and the dead card situation. However, this math at the bottom where it's talking about that if you run more lands, which Jason doesn't know what that means, if you run more lands, then it's less likely going to screw you over. My question is, would you do that? Because if I'm playing that many lands, there's a high there's some decks that just run a lot of lands, right? Like maybe your Curve's insane or something. But a lot of the decks that are running that many lands are land decks, right? It's Tatyova decks, it's Omnath decks, it's, decks like that. And in those decks, I'm actually running more basics than anything else, right? Because I want to like run as many effects as I can to get extra lands, right? Like I'm playing my Rampant Growth, my Cultivates, my Kodama's Reaches, and then I'll run some fetchable duels, so that I can also run like, Farseeks and 3 Visits and stuff like that. But that is taking away land slots that could be going to Temple of the False God or even Ancient Tomb. Like maybe in those decks, maybe you don't even run Ancient Tomb that often unless your curve is on top of you wanting a lot of landfall, you also have a high curve. Then yeah, sure, I would probably run Ancient Tomb. But even in that, like, do you even run Temple of the False God or Ancient Tomb in those decks? Because it's taking away from the ability for you to do your basic land ramp or your fetchable dual ramp, on top of the fact that you're going to have so much mana. What's one more mana? Like, yeah, there's always if only I had one more mana, I would have won the game. Okay, that person's wrong half the time anyways. And then the time that they're not wrong, the decks saying that, the people saying that are not running these kind of decks. They're not playing the decks that are making absurd amounts of mana. If you have absurd amount of mana, you're there. All right, the one extra mana is not going to matter. So is there any argument to that logic?
I think it's still worth running those sorts of lands because sometimes that one extra land, yeah, it might not seem like it's all that impactful, but I play a couple decks that, want to run a lot of lands. Sometimes that one extra mana does actually do your boost. I'm not going to be the guy who says, oh, one more mana, because no one likes that guy. But there are going to be times where that one extra mana, especially because it's one extra mana every turn. Like, that's not nothing.
Sure.
That's why these cards are played in the first place. It's an additional mana every single turn. And if you're playing one of those decks that has that many lands, one of the drawbacks of these cards is that it's colorless mana. you're probably not going to have to worry about that as long as you have enough lands to compensate for your what colors you need.
I'd be curious to see how often these decks actually win games. Unless it's a deck that's designed around having a lot of lands end of the battlefield or just having a lot of lands, period.
Yeah, landfall decks.
I would be curious to see exactly how many games a 42 land deck would have. I just don't. I think that once you take out 7 key cards and just replace them with 7 lands, going from, the 35 to the 42, I think that you just take out too much power in order to ensure that the deck is going to be viable for a win in most games. I'm not saying that every single deck that you bring to a table has to be able to stand up against, like power 10 decks or anything like that. But if you're pulling up to a casual game of Commander, how often does your deck win if it has 42 lands versus 35 lands? And in a deck where you have 42 lands, one thing you're going to run into more often is drawing lands when you don't need lands. You're going to get stuck more often in situations where I really need a card draw spell, or I really need a board wipe, or I really need a targeted removal spell. And now you're drawing, Ancient Tomb or Temple of the False God. Well, that doesn't help you at all in any situation that you're in right now. Having more mana doesn't help you when you need something like taken off the board. So I just think that if you want to run these in decks that have a lot of lands just because you're trying to guarantee that they're going to be playable, I'm talking Temple of the False God, then I see the reasoning behind it as far as the math, but I just think that you're going to run into a lot of other problems when you're in that situation. It's not going to be as advantageous as you might think it is.
Yeah, the only thing I would argue on that is just that I think, and I could be, there are obviously exceptions to this. Like if you're just a big mana deck, right? If you're playing like an Eldrazi deck or a big stompy deck, like maybe you just run that many lands just to make sure that you never miss a land drop so you can get to your big spells. Or like I said, you're probably a landfall deck, right? Like in your Tatyova deck, right? Don't you have like 39 lands or something like that? The difference between that. Yeah, like that's at least kind of close. Or like I used to have a landfall deck and I had like 41 lands in there. So like it's about the same, right? We're talking very minuscule changes. Because the landfall decks need to make sure that they actually hit it every single time.
Yeah, the difference there is like I don't mind if I draw a land late in the game when I have Tatyova on the battlefield because It's like, oh, I'll find a way to put this out into play and draw another card, gain another life. Because that's what the deck wants to do. So in that deck, I don't mind if I draw a land late in game when it's like, man, I really could use a spell that does this, because a land is essentially that spell potentially, just like, let me get this onto the battlefield and I'll try again.
Well, if you're running 40 plus lands, you're playing those cards. Like that's why you have 40 plus lands in your deck. Most of the time is because you have land synergies. You're making tokens, you're drawing cards, you're gaining life, you're dealing damage, you're doing something with that land.
I don't think that this math is specifically for decks that care about lands. I think it's just the math regarding if a deck has this many lands, this is what the math comes out to. I don't think it takes into account what actually is in the deck that cares about the lands or not.
I mean, we've said
you're not running that many unless that's why.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, the math on this is like worst case scenario, right? The math here is saying like this is assuming you didn't rampant growth. This is assuming you didn't draw extra cards other than the one per turn. This is like worst case scenario, right? So this is like not taking like deck strategies into account or anything like that. I just thought that it was interesting and worth having a discussion around that math. So did anyone have anything else that they wanted to add? Because I feel like we're at the point where we might want to start wrapping up, but is there anything major that we haven't talked about?
One point that I wanted to make was Ancient Tomb is also going to objectively be better than Temple of the False God after land destruction. if the first land you put onto the battlefield after every land has been destroyed is Temple of the False God, you might as well have just not played anything and discarded a card. If the first land that you play after mass land destruction is an Ancient Tomb, now you're likely 1 mana ahead of everyone else at the table.
I mean, in a hypothetical world, right? Land destruction would be allowed, right? Because every color has a way to hose on every color in some way, shape, or form, except for green, right? Green's main thing is it wants to get extra lands out, and it's okay to blow up artifacts, it's okay to blow up enchantments, but if you touch my lands, I'm a freak out, In a perfect world, we would allow land destruction in order to put the green player in check. But we're not in that world. We're in a world where it's taboo, it's frowned upon to blow up lands. And, like targeted land destruction, like, oh, that Field of the Dead's got to go, like that's okay. Like people get it. But like, no one's like Armageddoning in casual pods. Or if they do, they don't have friends anymore, So, but I agree with you. But I'm just saying that doesn't line. Utopia and reality are not cohesive, Preston, is there anything major that you feel like we haven't touched on today?
I mean, real quick, I gotta say the reality of that is people do play those spells. People do play land destruction. It's not common. It's not very well accepted, but people do it. And, it is something that you should plan for in any scenario. In any game you go into, I think that you should always think, what do I do if my lands get destroyed? And if the answer is, well, then I probably lose the game. Sometimes that's the answer.
Yeah, that's fair. But yeah, Preston, did you have anything to add that we maybe haven't touched on yet?
Well, I think we've covered all the big points, but I wanted to end this with I want to say I like both of these cards. I don't hate Ancient Tomb by any means. I play both of them in my mono white Avacyn deck because that deck needs 1,000 mana and it's mono white. So, I run both of those lands. I like both of these lands. I don't want this debate to be like, oh, Preston actually hates Ancient Tomb. I don't. I just think it's a little overhyped. I think Temple of the False God gets hate it doesn't deserve, and people should stop trying to shove everything into the best card ever or the worst card ever, because I know that's just what humans do as a species, is something is either the best thing they've ever had, the worst thing they've ever had, or the most middle of the road you've ever had. So when most things are actually within a spectrum, our brains just don't process that very well. So it's important to try to step back and remember that that's not actually how things work most of the time. Sometimes this is better, sometimes that's better. Both can be good, both can be bad. There's not a correct option every single time.
I want to say this. I absolutely despise Temple of the False God. And it's not for any reason other than I just wish that they would reprint Ancient Tomb. Instead of printing Temple of the False God, print Ancient Tomb. It's clearly shown that its value is going to be maintained over the years after it gets reprinted. I mean, the last time it got reprinted was Lord of the Rings, right?
It was a box topper, yeah.
Yeah. So and that one isn't even, that one's about $90. That one is about the price of a normal Ancient Tomb. So why can't we get one set of Commander Precons where we get an Ancient Tomb? Why can't we get a standard set that has it, maybe once a year? It's a better card, and it doesn't really need to be that expensive because of the drawback. But I feel the same way about cards like Mana Vault. I don't think Mana Vault is that good. But I don't like Temple of the False Gods because it gives Wizards an excuse not to reprint really good cards that we need reprints of. Because now they can just say, well, we have Temple of the False God. Why do we need to reprint Ancient Tomb? Because it's a better card, Wizards.
Yeah, I mean, think of how unlikely it would be that we would ever have this discussion if price wasn't a factor. If instead of putting Ancient Tomb in all the if they were putting Ancient Tomb in the precons instead of Temple of the False God, would we even be having this talk? Like if Ancient Tomb was
not even a reserve
$1,
list card.
Yeah, like
why are they trying to keep its value so high?
Yeah, I mean, if
Just
they were like
put more of them out there.
And it doesn't have to go in like every precon or anything like that. But if it was like, even if it was just like a box top or an Ixalan, like that would have been kind of nice. It would have been kind of thematical, or maybe it was on the list or something in that set. At least get a few more out there. And then like, not that every precon needs it, but like, the big mana precons, or like, last year we had the Eldrazi precon, Yeah, there are definitely opportunities to reprint it that they don't, and I wonder if this would even be a conversation. But so I guess with that said, Jason, do you even have Temple in any of your decks?
No.
Okay, so I'm kind of in the middle. When I am building my decks in the 1-2 color range, I auto include Ancient Tomb. Anything in the 3 to 5 color range, I really need to just assess what my curve looks like. Like I have a deck that's 4 color with Umari as the companion, so it's like creatures only, and the curve's kind of high. I do have Ancient Tomb in that, even though it's 4 colors, just because my curve is so ridiculous. But a lot of the time, past 1 or 2 colors, I'm not playing Ancient Tomb. Temple, I don't hate it the way that Jason does, but I do not run it that often. And it's often like the decks that are running a lot of lands, but they're not green. Because I firmly believe that like if I'm playing green, I just have so many more efficient pieces of ramp that I don't need Temple of the False God. Like maybe having it in there, maybe it like wouldn't hurt me, but it's just, to me, it's never been worth the risk. So with that said, I have, I think 25, I should have double checked this before we recorded. I have 25 commander decks. I think Ancient Tomb is in probably 12 of them. Maybe not that many. It's like maybe 10. I probably have Temple of the False God in 4. So it's not that I would never run it. But I feel like it's upside versus downside is harder to justify than it is for Ancient Tomb. And I think something that we didn't really talk about very much is that Jason's right, like he said this at the beginning of the episode, that there is just a lot of incidental life gain in Commander, or there should be. Like if you don't have just a couple pieces, like if you're a 2-color deck, you can probably afford to run the enters the battlefield tap, gain you a life. You could probably afford to run a couple of creatures that have lifelink. You could probably have, there's little bits here and there that they can add up. If you just have a few pieces in your deck that gain you a little bit of life, it evens out quite a bit.
Just throwing in a Soul Warden.
Yeah, if you're a white deck, especially if you're you can't rely on your opponents playing a bunch of creatures, but if you have a bunch of creatures, there's not really a reason to not play Soul Warden. Yeah. Well, guys, it's hard to say, but I think we're short enough that we have time to do a quick something cool outside of the world of Magic. Preston, Jason, anything you want to share with the people? Something you've been enjoying, something you think is cool, something cool going on in your life, something like a show or a movie you've enjoyed, something cool outside of the world of Magic.
The Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, boy.
About to go win another Super Bowl, dude. I'm calling it. I'm calling it right now. This is coming out after. This is coming out after, but I'm calling it right now. The Chiefs won the Super Bowl. I'll even predict the score right now in my head.
Okay.
Chiefs 31, 49ers 19.
So you don't even think it's going to be that close?
Nope.
Yeah,
Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl is a different animal, baby.
That is true. Hopefully you didn't just jinx it. I mean, this is coming out. We're recording it 2 days before the Super Bowl. So
the first year the Chiefs went to the Super Bowl, the first year Patrick Mahomes went to the Super Bowl, I said they were going to win. They won. I did say they were going to beat Tom Brady, but that was a mistake. I should never have doubted Tom Brady.
Never bet against Tom Brady.
I shouldn't have done that. But then when they went to the Super Bowl against Philly, You know, it's like they're going to win that one too. And then at the beginning of this year, I think I said this on the channel before, I went to the Chiefs versus Lions, the first game of the season. And even after the Lions won that game, I was telling Chiefs fans in the stadium, you guys are still going to win the Super Bowl. Don't worry. You guys are still going to win the Super Bowl. You have Patrick Mahomes. He's the greatest quarterback who's ever played football. You're going to win the Super Bowl. Don't worry. So I've known this was going to happen since day one of the season. It's guaranteed. The man is not human. He's just not.
He is kind of a beast. Preston, anything cool outside of the world of Magic?
Not really on my end. I've mostly been focusing on brewing around some of the new cards from the set. So I've just been sticking to Magic this past week or so.
Fair enough. I will say I have been really into Pal World. So for those of you who don't know, it's so fun, dude. It's
Are
really
they
dumb.
sued?
Yeah, they're getting sued by Nintendo. For those of you who don't know,
Good.
it's a game that's it's like a survivalish game, right? Like Ark or Minecraft or something like that. However, there's like these Pokemon ripoff in it, and you can catch them, and they can you can ride them around, and they can help you build your forts and stuff like that. And it's kind of cutesy anime art. It seemed really dumb, but I've been playing it with my brothers quite a bit, and it's pretty fun. I'm gonna be honest. I actually really enjoy it.
I guess one other really cool thing. Well, maybe it's not really cool. I think it's cool. I started another Skyrim game. I told you guys about it, but I started another Skyrim game couple days ago. Oh god!
If I had a little bit more
done.
free time, I would start a new Skyrim game. But between editing Commander Clash and all the stuff I'm doing here at Geek and Sleek, I do not have the time to start a new Skyrim game. But I want to. I haven't played it in like at least a year, probably more.
I've left it alone for a couple days, and I miss it.
Yeah.
Now that I think about it, Honkai Star Rail just had an update, so I have been doing that.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think you've talked about that before here. Yeah. Well, guys, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let us know in the comments what you think about Ancient Tomb versus Temple of the False God. Is price a big factor to you? Or are you just proxying it up if you can't afford it? Do you run both? Do you just run one over the other? Let us know. In any case, hope you guys have had a great week. We hope you have a great week going forward. I guess this is coming out on Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day. If you have a special someone in your life, tell them thank you. Tell them you love them because you play Magic the Gathering, so you're kind of a loser. So you should appreciate them for them putting up with you. And then happy Ash Wednesday as well for any of us our religious fans out there. And hope to see you guys.
Religious fans?
Yeah.
Like Jesus' fan club?
Yeah. You don't know what Ash Wednesday is?
I do.
Okay.
Fans.
And then hopefully the Chiefs win the Super Bowl. And if they don't, you can roast